Grüß, willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 9 of my LWRS or Bewegungskrieg series of videos. In this case I'll be discussing an ad hoc card-based scenario generation system which I am developing, with the initial version available to download from the LWRS or Bewegungskrieg IO group sites. This video is going to be covering a card-based ad hoc scenario system for the LWRS set of rules. Bewegungskrieg is the same rules, but reformatted and renamed to avoid any confusion. The key point about this set of rules is each element represents a company or company-sized formation. Both sets of rules are free and can be accessed from the IO group site. After, I think, successfully designing an ad hoc scenario generation system using cards for a number of different sets of rules, I've decided to attempt this with LWRS or Bewegungskrieg. The gritty details of the various card-based scenario systems can be found in other videos specifically related to the rules that they're associated with. But in simple terms, a player has force mix cards, which represents formations, and special cards, which represent special events, tactics or strategies. The force mix cards number 9 and contain the element details and a points value based on when it enters the game. On game turn 1, a card may have a value of 12 points. At the midpoint of a game, normally game turn 7, it will have a value of 6 points. Players decide when the card enters and takes note of the points values. The special cards number 27 are divided into 9 card sets. A player selects one card from each set, which represents the player's plan, and then ends up with 9 cards. These 9 special cards are shuffled in with the 9 force mix cards, and players select cards randomly until the points limit for the scenario is reached. The resulting cards represents a player's force mix and reinforcement schedule, with the special cards representing the player's plan, such as, let's say, flank attack, hidden unit, special objectives, and so on. For Ancients, there are no force mix cards. Each player builds up a force using DBMM army lists and points values. The special cards are the only cards which are randomly selected. For players who could not be bothered to calculate their force mix, I do provide some standard 200 and 400 point mix force cards for those players if they so desire. That summarises roughly the card system up to this point. When I started working on the card-based system for LWRS, I discovered a major issue. The scale the rules used made my World War II card-based system not exactly suitable. I had the same issue with ancient battles, but the driver there was rather different. Ancient battles rarely had reinforcements arriving, but in this case, and in that case, the solution was reasonably simple. You just simply didn't have force mix cards. But in this case, I do need force mix cards, and the solution was not as simple as I originally expected. All my prior World War II and Cold War card-based systems uses an element scale of a battalion. This means each card represents a division. Using that scale, it was reasonable to expect different divisions to arrive at different points in time as reinforcements, and this could very well be quite random. However, with LWRS, which uses an element scale of one company, even if the basic combat unit is still a battalion, I had some major issues. This means each player was generally only fielding a division, or in many cases only part of a division, in a game. When you field a division, that is if the whole card set represents a division, each individual card would represent regiments or battalions which are under divisional control. It's unlikely each of these formations would arrive in the playing area randomly, as if they were part of the same division. The player would have significantly more control. But even if you would expect these various formations to arrive randomly, there was another issue. As the cards represent both regiments and specific battalions which were under divisional control, using a random system meant that the force mix you may end up with could be incredibly unusual. After quite a bit of experimentation, I determined the best system was to allow the player to simply select from all the available division cards and build up a force mix reinforcement schedule with no random card picking. The random events would still be randomly selected, as is the case of my standard card system, but the force mixes were not to be selected randomly, and that pretty much resolved that issue. The remaining issue I had was how to ensure the players received a set of cards which would allow them to deploy a reasonable reinforcement schedule and initial force mix for any kind of battle that a player may desire. There was no point offering cards which always resulted in one side defending and the other side attacking due to the card selections available, so I had to make it as flexible as possible. Another side effect, it's not really an issue, but it was a side effect of this, was that each nationality in a given campaign would have several types of divisions available for them to use. I needed to allow players to field the kind of formations they wanted rather than forcing, let's say, the Polish in 1939 to always field an infantry division. The final solution to this was to allow each player a selection of 2, 3 or even 4 different division size card sets, with each set consisting of 9 cards. A player would select the division they wanted for the game and would then build their force build and reinforcement schedule according to that set of cards. If they ran out of cards, they could then select another division and select only the cards they needed. This allowed the Polish player, for example, to initially select a mechanised brigade. That would quickly run out of cards. They wouldn't be able to hit their 48-point total. Then they would select a division, and then they would just pick the bits of the division they wanted to build up their force mix. And that seems quite reasonable. This kind of system allowed each player the full range of force mix options to align with their particular desires or wishes for a particular game. Some historical limitations still applied, such as availability of air support, but putting that to one side, the Polish player in 1939 could build an attack force mix if the player wished to do so, or a defence force mix, or something in between. There were some interesting final issues that I had to overcome. As the key element of a panzer division, for example, is its 3 regiments, each regiment was incredibly powerful. A 48-point game would mean a German player would only really ever end up selecting one regiment with supporting formations if they wanted to do an initial attack. However, this was more an issue related to the significantly high points value of Panzer Division or German Panzer Division than anything inherently wrong with the game system or this system. The issue that really finally is causing me the greatest amount of consternation is that the Germans typically would break up a Panzer Division into a number of Kampfgruppen. This was not so common in 1939, so for a Polish campaign, not a big issue, but by 1941, this was pretty much the way the Germans always ran their Panzer divisions. The battalions would be normally paired with a Panzergrenadier battalion, and the remaining Panzergrenadier battalions then paired with other divisional support battalions, normally resulting in around about 3 Kampfgruppen. Because of the very high costs of German regiments, this caused an issue. It was very difficult for the Germans to form up their 41 Panzer divisions as they did historically. A player can certainly mix and match elements as they wish if all the elements arrived on a single game turn, but this was unlikely for a German Panzer division due to the high cost of regiments. Luckily for LWRS, the Panzer regiment was able to operate independently with minimal issues, as would a Panzergrenadier regiment, but this limitation does irk me. A better system would probably be for my cards to reflect these Kampfgruppen, and I may yet change the cards accordingly, or at least provide, let's say, a special option for the German Panzer Division. They can either field a Panzer Division as the formal structure, or you would have a set of 9 cards which broke that Panzer Division up into the Kampfgruppen accordingly. Interestingly enough, the other nationality which used this kind of Kampfgruppen type system, the US Armored Division, there was no issue, as the cards would already be organised into US combat commands. The only other area where we may have another issue, apart from the Germans, would be the British after September 1944, when they started also adopting a more mixed formation strategy. Prior to that, probably not so much of an issue. And of course, you wouldn't really have that problem with the Russians. I'm not quite sure about the Japanese. The Japanese did do a lot of mixing and matching, so I'd have to build up some cards to determine if it was an issue. But it's something that I need to consider in the future. Moving away from the force mix cards, let's look at the special cards. Special cards follow my standard WW2 structure, with some cards modified due to the rules. Players can, as you can see, try for a flank attack, an ambush, have special objectives and combat bonuses, whatever the player so desires. The special cards really do represent the players, or the selection process represents the players building up their plan. I also build the weather effects into the cards, which players can ignore if they wish, and quite often when I have a game I certainly do ignore the weather effects. As my cards are all based on specific historical campaigns, the regions, that's the location, and season is fixed, with weather effects within those constraints being the only variable factors, which is what I reflect in these cards. Let's look at an example of a player building up a force mix and a reinforcement schedule. In this example, the German player has selected the following initial forces. This totals 36 points and indicates the German player wishes to be the attacker. This force is based on a Panzer battalion with supporting formations, or a Panzer regiment with supporting formations. For Q2, which is typically a game turn 4 in a 12 game turn game, the German has the artillery regiment arrive. This has a value of 9 points because it's arriving in Q2. If it was arriving in Q1, it would be a value of 12 points, and if it was at the end of the game, 3 points. Finally, in Q3, or once again, if it's a 12 game turn 7, the Germans get their air support. This has a value of 6 points because it arrives in Q3. When we total up all these values, we end up with 53 points, which means the German player has a -5 VP penalty. They have gone 5 points over their normal limit of 48 points. Most games I set for 48 points. Players can go for bigger or smaller, and if you have multiple players each side, you could probably double the number of points easily. You've got lots of divisions. But if for a typical 2-player game that you want to finish within 2 to 4 hours, 48 points is probably the optimal size. And in this case, the Germans have gone over, and their penalty is they have a -5 VP, which they have to overcome. The reason why I've gone down this ad hoc card-based scenario system is I want players to be presented with unique situations, with significant player input in creating those situations. Scenarios are good, but they do have a limited replay value. There is also the issue of someone playtesting a scenario and working out a winning tactic while the other player may not have done it. You could argue that, well, one player made more effort, he should win, but it doesn't quite make a very good gaming experience, particularly if you want to bring in new players. A card-based system also has the benefit of giving player cards with the element values printed on them. The player basically has a cheat sheet for the specific force mixes that they're using on the playing area. For some rules, that's a big benefit. Not so much for LWRS, but for some rules, trust me, it's a big benefit. I did have some issues here as LWRS has a surprisingly complex element value system. I wanted to put as much info as I could on the cards for the units or elements, and the result is a rather complex system, which I will briefly cover now. The values in the parentheses, as you can see here, represents an element's fire points, or basically the number of d6 dice they will roll. When there is only one value, it's used in all cases. When there are two values, as you can see here, such as 2/1, this means that against armour targets you would use the higher value, but when firing at infantry you would use the lower. This is because the weapon does not have an efficient HE round, or that's not its main purpose. In close combat you would always use the higher value. The value which follows the fire points in parentheses is the element's movement allowance in centimetres. Most elements will have a movement allowance of 6 or 10 centimetres. If the element or unit is an aircraft, its movement allowance is A. If it's a helicopter, its movement allowance is indicated with a H symbol. If the element is an artillery element, its range is indicated in the brackets at the end. In this case, the artillery element has a range of 60 centimetres. If the element is an anti-aircraft element, that range is its anti-aircraft range. The AA range, element range, is indicated in the same brackets, in this case 36 centimetres. The only difference is that it's differentiated from indirect fire with a small or lowercase a. The value in front of the parentheses is the grade of the element, which in this case is 1. This means the gun has a grade of 1 and the armour has a grade of 1. If the grade value has two values, as you can see here, 2/1, this means the gun and armour grades are different. In this case, the gun grade is 2 and the armour grade is 1. This element is an infantry element. It has a grade of 2/S. Unless infantry has a ranged anti-tank weapons, such as ATGWs, this value is only applicable when in close combat if the target is armoured. If the target is not armoured, this is the gun grade for both ranges and close combat. The second value of S means the target is soft. It basically has no armour. This is an infantry element. If we go back to the artillery element we saw earlier, you'll notice this has a grade of 3/S. These values are used when this element is conducting direct fire combat or is in close combat. It is not used when conducting indirect fire. In this case, the gun value is 3 and of course it's a soft target. Some indirect fire weapons lack a grade for direct fire purposes. This means the element cannot conduct direct fire against any target, although in close combat it can conduct combat against soft attackers, but not against armoured attackers. I'm uncertain if this is a valid thing in the rules, as the rules don't normally cover light mortars very much. I must admit adding this myself, and other players may basically disagree with my interpretation, but in these rules, particularly for World War II, I normally reflect light and medium mortars, which do have some minimal impact in the game. Players can decide to simply use or consider these as heavy weapon elements if they don't like my modification to the rules. Talking about heavy weapons element, if the heavy weapon element has an FP value of 2, or the element has a FP value of 2, it is a heavy weapon element, as you can see here, which is an MMG Polish. We come up to another of my own personal modification, but in this case the aircraft only possesses one fire point. In the standard rules, all the aircraft are the same with a fire point of 3. I have modified this and allowed aircraft to have different FP values depending on the type of aircraft. If the value was 0, then this aircraft element could only be used to neutralise an enemy air unit and would not be suited for air-to-ground combat. While anti-aircraft elements are mainly designed to neutralise enemy air units, they can also be used in ground combat as per the standard rules. The values are indicated here. In this case, the FP is 2 against armoured and 1 against soft targets for direct fire, 2 against everything in close combat. The grade is 2/S, which means its gun grade is 2, and the element, of course, is a soft element target. The movement allowance is 10 centimetres. Players can actually identify the element type by looking at the values on the right if you convert the numbers into basically the way the rules work. But the name of the element can also provide a valuable clue in terms of the element type. In this case, this element is a Panzerkampfwagen 4C, which means it's basically a medium tank with a medium gun. Players can simply look at the name of the element to identify its combat values if they so desire. One of the major benefits that I discovered with the card-based system for these rules is it can display the grade values for an element during the period the cards cover. Thus you'll notice the grade values of the Panzerkampfwagen 4 will change as you move from 1939 to 1945. While I personally feel using a relative grade system for gun and armour is a very good idea and does achieve all the basic good design objectives, but it does make the creation of army lists rather difficult. A card system builds that into the cards and resolves it, particularly for scenario generation purposes. Of course, you don't have any issue if you're going to do a historical scenario because you've got the same benefits of using a card. You've got a fixed period, that all the weapons were much the same. But if you want to create an army list which covers the entire war, you've got some difficult problems to overcome. And so I come to a close of my part 9 of my LWRS or Bewegungskrieg series of video, in this case covering an ad hoc card-based scenario generation system. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.